Hi, my name is Stuart Weems and welcome to the Investopoly podcast. Our goal is to deliver easy to understand, evidence-based holistic insights to help you master the game of building wealth. And in today's episode, I'd like to talk about property management, how to manage the property manager, what realistic expectations to have, and just some general tips in regards to that, because I think there's a bit of a void of information out there, and quite often people just really end up learning through experience, trial and error more than anything else. And, one of the downsides or negatives associated with owning investment properties is they can take up time. If you've got, some complex maintenance requirements or a problem tenant or these sorts of things, you might have to spend a bit of time on it. Whereas with other asset classes like a share portfolio, for instance, there's not much you really need to do in that regard, especially if it's invested. So I guess the whole point is we've got to acknowledge that some time is required, but then make sure that, you're getting the most value for money from your property manager and therefore minimizing the amount of time that you've got to spend on it as well. So, the first thing I want to start with is setting some realistic expectations, because a great property manager can be wonderful and a poor one can be absolutely terrible. And it's a really important asset and a really important job that they're doing, but they're kind of the meat in the sandwich, if you like, because they've got to deal with tenants, and tenants can sometimes have unrealistic expectations about whether a landlord should fix a particular issue or improve something in the property, and maybe have unrealistic expectations about how quickly that might need to be done. On the other side, you've got the investor, and the investor doesn't really want to be spending money on a property, which is not to say that good investors shouldn't look to improve and maintain their property, but the less you can spend on it, I guess a better way to put it is avoiding unnecessary costs, is certainly in the investor's favor. And over the last decade or so, the amount of compliance obligations because of changes in the tenancy laws and so forth is ridiculous. So the amount that a property manager does today versus 10 years ago is massively different. So we've got compliance checks, tighter control over rental increases, evictions, minimum rental standards are making sure they're up to scratch. Their workload has changed a lot. And, the pay scales in property management aren't fantastic. Most property managers are earning between $70,000 and $80,000 a year, which is not a tiny salary, of course, but it's only going to attract more junior staff. Now, you do get career property manager professionals, and they tend to, oversee the team and manage the overall portfolio of properties and so forth. And they're important. They're the people that we really need, and they're the people that you need to find in order to experience a better outcome. Because obviously you want the property manager that is actually doing the day-to-day work. They might not have a heap of experience, but if they're being mentored by someone that's been doing it for many years or decades, then that's really where you're going to get a much better outcome. The good thing is technology has certainly helped in the property management space. A lot of things now are quite automated, and I think that helps both in terms of tenant communication and landlord communication as well as managing, whether it's a maintenance request or following up the rent or anything like that. So really the context you need to think about then is, a property manager probably has 100 things to do in any particular day, and they don't necessarily have the time to spend, hours and hours on every maintenance request or inspection or any of these sorts of things. So, and typically in an environment like that, the squeaky wheel gets the most noise. And if the wheel's not squeaking, it probably doesn't get looked at. So you've got to understand, what a property manager does, what their day-to-day looks like, and the challenges that they kind of deal with. And I think then that gives you, a place to sort of come from a more realistic expectations. And so, as I said, squeaky wheel gets the most oil. And I think that's probably one of the things that I've learnt from being a property investor for many decades is you've got to make a pain of yourself, which I'm not saying you've got to, be difficult to deal with or unpleasant or unappreciative. In fact, the reverse. But I'm saying you can't just approve every maintenance request off the back. I mean, you can if you're absolutely certain that they're legitimate and reasonable and those sorts of things. But every now and again, you've got to push back. Property maintenance is a bit of a funny one to kind of navigate because on one hand, you do, as I said, want to keep expenses to the minimum, so you're improving your investment's cash flow. On the other hand, preventative maintenance can save you a lot of money down the track. And quite often with property maintenance, it can only ever be delayed, not avoided completely. So if you avoid spending money on a particular maintenance issue this year, it's just likely that you probably have to spend more money next year or the year after to rectify whatever problem you've got. So it's important that we take the approach to make sure that we understand that there's a opportunity cost here and that preventative maintenance is typically a good thing to do. The other thing too is if you look after your property, there's a much greater chance the tenant will do so. But if I put that in reverse, if you don't look after your property and you sort of treat it with a bit of contempt, then it's difficult then to ask the tenant to look after your property if you're not willing to. And I've always taken that approach that, I want to provide good quality rental accommodation. I'm not going to, spend money on frivolous maintenance requests, but I need to make sure that I keep the property up to scratch. Now, if you do get a maintenance request, don't automatically assume that this is the right thing to do, as in what maintenance is suggested is the right thing to do. A good property manager will think about these things, but again, they could have a rough day. It could be, that they could have had 100 different things go wrong that day, and maybe they've overlooked to think of something or consider something, and you can't rely on the fact that they're going to, spend a lot of time on these sorts of things, and you're the owner and it's your responsibility. So when you get a maintenance request, you've got to really critically look at the maintenance request and take responsibility for it, not just rely on whatever the property manager has told you. So for instance, I just recently got a request for a property that my wife and I own, and the outdoor veranda that the ceiling was sagging. And we knew when we purchased the property that we knew at that time it was sagging, it might have to be replaced one day. Anyway, the tenant complained to say, look, it's almost going to fall down soon, so okay, time's come to replace it. The property manager made a recommendation of who to replace it, whatever seemed reasonable. But we asked the question, what is the cause? Is it just general wear and tear, or is there a leak in the roof, for instance, and water's getting in and that's what's causing the sagging? So the property manager hadn't asked that question, and it'd be great if they did ask the question, but I don't expect them to do so. I know that is my role as the property owner. And so I asked the question, they went back to the tradie and worked it out. It took them a couple of weeks to get an answer. Nothing's that quick with these sorts of things, but we got the answer. It's fine. It's just general wear and tear. But I think that's a good example of, not needing to take things on face value and just make sure that if you're going to spend money rectifying a particular issue, that it's the permanent or as permanent as possible rectification. The second element is checking to make sure that the costs are appropriate and reasonable. And there's no harm asking for a second opinion or a second quote. It's their job to, source those sorts of things. And they've typically got relationships with various different handymen or tradesmen or these sorts of things, those sorts of people providing those sort of services. So it's really easy for them to get a second quote if they need one. And we shouldn't be, as landlords, afraid to ask. Now, sometimes I've had clients ask me, do they get kickbacks? Are they giving work to certain people, et cetera, et cetera? Now, that shouldn't be the case. They shouldn't be receiving any kickbacks or rebates or anything like that. But of course, I can't say absolutely every property manager is doing the right thing. If you suspect something like that, you should ask them a direct question, probably by email, so it's in writing. Is there any financial incentive for you to recommend that particular person? Just to give you the opportunity to remove that potential concern, because if they're not actually receiving a kickback, you don't need to then worry about it. And if they are, well, then maybe it gives you a little bit of a red flag in regards to the quality of that particular property manager. Now, with property inspections, a property manager should be doing a physical property inspection at least every year, which means they walk through the property, take photos, all those sorts of things. If you want to attend the inspection, that's fine. You just need to notify your property manager in advance of them arranging the inspection. And I think they're good to attend, maybe not every year, but every so often. But particularly if there's an issue with the property. So if there's some cracking or leaking or these sorts of things, and it's going to become a potential issue, being able to walk through the property, actually visually inspect the matter, gives you a better basis for sort of understanding the cost of rectification and those sorts of things. So it also shows to the property manager and the tenant that you're an engaged landlord, that you do care about your property. And I think it sends a really good message in that regard. As I said, don't need to do do it every year, but I think attending inspections periodically makes a bit of sense. If your investment property is interstate, so it's not in your domicile state or close by, of course, that can be a little bit trickier, but typically a property manager can give the tenant typically between 7 and 14 days notice to conduct an inspection. Now, there are in some states limits to how many inspections you can undertake during a year, but if you're interstate and you know you're travelling, it could be an opportunity just to shoot the property manager an email in advance to say, look, I'm going to be in town. Can we arrange an inspection for one of these days? And, that could be a good opportunity for you to inspect the property. Now, let's talk about rent increases and your approach. And look, I'm going to share what I do. It might not be perfect for everyone, so I'm not saying my way or the highway, but, an investor's goal is really to maximize the cash flow that comes out of the asset. Now, most properties tend to be negative cash flow, negatively geared. So it's really about minimizing the costs, the holding costs. That doesn't necessarily translate to increasing rental income as much as possible. You've got to think about all expenses. So if you've got a tenant that pays the rent on time, looks after, any sort of minor issues, like if they can do their own little bits of maintenance, they've got the toilet's not flushing properly, they go and fix that or something like that, and you don't hear much from them, they can be a good tenant, because if you replace them with a tenant that's going to pay another $50 a week, a bad tenant or a nuisance tenant could easily eat up $50 a week in additional and wasteful maintenance requests. Of course, if you put up the rent and your tenant leaves, you've got the cost of vacancy. So how long will the property be vacant for? And you're losing rental income on. And also there's going to be another letting fee as well that you have to pay the property manager. Typically between 1 and 2 weeks rent is what they charge. And then there could be some advertising costs. So it's not a riskless exercise just to say, look, we're going to keep increasing the rent each and every year, because if it gives rise to a changeover of tenant, there's a cost associated with that as well. So typically my approach is, if I've got a good tenant, and as I said, a good tenant is looking after the property, keeping it in good condition, and we don't hear much from them in terms of maintenance requests, then I will be a little bit reluctant to increase rent up to the market value. So I'll certainly review it and I'll certainly increase it, but not necessarily to the extent that I could. Now, that means that the longer that tenant stays in that property, the property will become under rented. The current rent is well below the market value rent. And so that's fine, but you don't want that to be like that forever, because, if you had the same tenant for 10 years, after 10 years, you'll be well under rented. So I think sometimes it's actually makes sense, or it's in my favor, to turn tenants over every 5 years or so. And I think it just happens naturally anyway. There's nothing you need to do to sort of interject on that. But I think that my approach to rent reviews is really to be as fair as possible and to recognize that a good tenant actually saves you money in terms of avoids silly maintenance requests and those sorts of things. And also, if they're paying on time and they're not a nuisance from that perspective, there's some value in that as well. Now, I said a good property manager can make your life a lot easier. A good property manager is going to be on the ball, going to look after your property in the same way that you would look after it, and is going to be responsive to any requests from the tenant and responsive to your requests as well. Typically, it's about finding a career property manager. So someone that's really dedicated many years or even decades to be in that industry, that likes the job and that wants to do some good work. And really the best way to find a person like that is through referrals. Now, I find buyer's agents are a good source of referrals, particularly buyer's agents that are specialists in that geographical location, because I'll typically get to know them, and they deal with a lot of investors, and they typically get to know, who's who in the zoo in terms of which property managers in that particular location are the good ones. And again, typically the good ones it really comes down to an individual, not a particular agency. So it's not about a particular brand. It really comes back to the people. But if you're having problems with your property manager, it's really about escalating that feedback to the person, to the manager or the owner of the business. Sometimes if they might have a sales side and a property management side. And sometimes in these situations, the owner of the agency is on the sales side and it's just a sort of side business in terms of property management. You've got to be aware of that. Beware of it, I should say, not aware, because it needs to be a person's core business for them to do it properly. But if you're not getting any joy, then I think ask around, speak to some buyers agents, speak to anyone else in the industry that you trust to find a good referral. Switching property managers isn't a big deal. Like, it's pretty simple to do. I mean, you've got to check what your agreement says, but typically most agreements say that you've got to provide 28 days notice or 4 weeks notice. And it's as simple as just notifying your property manager, I'm switching to a new manager, and your new manager will do most of the work. So they'll contact the incumbent property manager and transfer the files and notify the tenants and pick up the keys and do all those sorts of things. Look, I've been relatively lucky. I think if I look back, I haven't had to sack too many property managers. I think it's just about, making the right decision from the get-go. But I do know that it does take a bit of time to manage them and manage the property. Also, they've got this, I've always thought they've got this little bit of a conflict of interest because, they're in the business of renting properties and they need enough people to walk through these properties, enough tenants to walk through these properties to get them rented. And they've also got to make sure that they've got a pretty good reputation with renters. If a property manager is a bit too aggressive in that way, they'll just get a couple of bad Google reviews and no one then wants to rent a property from them. So I feel like sometimes there is a bit of a conflict because we're the landlords, we're the one that's paying for the service, but sometimes the tenants are the ones that are being kind of looked after. And it is a bit of a balancing act. And I think we've got to recognize that, look, it's not an us or them situation. It's not binary and not like we're on either sides of the chessboard, as it were. We're really sitting on the same side of the table, I think, in terms of I would see my role as a landlord to really look after the tenant. And if I look after the tenant, they're going to look after me in terms of my property. And a good property manager will also take a similar approach. In terms of fees, property management fees, what can you expect to pay? Well, they vary significantly across Australia. I mean, in Melbourne and Sydney, property management costs are typically 6 to 7%, maybe 6 to 8% as a big range. And the letting fee tends to be 1 to 1.5 weeks of rent. So that's what you can expect to pay in Melbourne and Sydney. In Brisbane, fees are slightly higher, range between 7.5% and 9%. Adelaide and Perth have the highest fees, ranging from 9 to 11%. So you can see if you own property in different parts of Australia, you're going to pay sort of different management fees. And I guess that's probably just to, volume and competition. As the saying goes, fees what you pay, value is what you receive. So I don't base my decisions on fees alone. I'm quite happy to pay a property manager a fair fee, something in that range, even if it's the higher end of the range. But as long as they're going to look after my property and deliver a good service, then I'm quite happy to pay a fair fee for that. Selecting tenants can be a tricky exercise as well, particularly if you don't have experience in doing so. So to my mind, a great tenant does two things. They obviously pay their rent on time and they look after the property, and that they will handle small, minor issues like minor toilet repairs or unblocking a drain or doing something like that without necessarily needing to call a tradesperson. Because once I had a property tenant moved in, they couldn't light the gas hot water service and they called out a plumber to light the gas hot water service. Now, I'm not criticising, I don't know the full details, right? So it could have been a difficult one to light or difficult circumstances or whatever it is. But if you've got a tenant that's able to do that themselves and work it out for themselves, then obviously that saves quite a bit of cost. Now, in my experience, if the prospective tenant hasn't rented before, that can be a bit of a red flag, because sometimes people that don't have a rental history don't have realistic expectations. Again, we had a tenant in a property, they moved in and they said, well, we don't have enough PowerPoints. Can we put, 10 more PowerPoints in the property or something like that? Well, it wasn't like the property wasn't functional. I mean, it had plenty of PowerPoints. And once you inspect a property, of course, as a tenant, that's what you're renting. You saw it, you thought it was acceptable. You can't get in and move the goalposts and renovate. But it's a good example of, how if they don't have a lot of experience, that might not necessarily be realistic. The other thing to keep in mind too is older tenants or tenants on higher incomes tend to be less likely to share a property with others. So as in rent out a room or do something like that. So I typically look for tenants that have a good rental history. Of course, that's not to say that I won't consider a tenant that doesn't have a rental history. I mean, we're all got to start somewhere, but just as a general thing, if I'm comparing two tenants and one has a history, that'll put them slightly ahead to my mind. And then, you want to look for the type of tenant that's going to look after your property and not rent out a room, and it's not going to end up with 10 different students living in that property, for instance. Now, the property manager is key here. They'll know, they can sniff this sort of stuff out. And also, we're looking at an application form, and now there's going to be standard application forms used around Australia which restrict what questions you can ask and how much you can ask. And to my mind, that just makes the property manager even more important. So they're the ones that are speaking to them on the phone or in person, and they can start to sort of pick up any sort of signs, and they might be able to sort of find out more information that might not necessarily be on the application form. So I very much rely on the advice from the property manager, but they're just some of the things that I look at when selecting a potential tenant. So there you go. That's really sort of sums up my experience with property managers and my advice in that regard. I think I'd sum it up by saying, it's unrealistic to expect it's not going to take any time. It probably shouldn't take much more than 1 to 2 hours a year in total in terms of responding to the property manager or considering maintenance requests or doing something, some sort of admin like that. So it's not like we're spending hours and hours each year, but there is some time commitment required. And, it's easy just to say yes to every email and not get involved. But, I think that's not necessarily the right approach, that it's your property, it's your responsibility to look after it. And it's your responsibility to ask the right questions from the property manager. The property manager is there to manage the property and follow your requests, but you've got to make sure you're asking those right questions. But I think if you get a great property manager, and also if you've got the right property, investment grade assets tend to attract a higher quality of tenant, and as a result you tend to not have too many problems. I've never had a really major tenant problem. Well, I haven't had any real tenant problems actually over the last 20 years, and I can't remember the last time one of my clients did as well. So the type of property and the location it is also goes towards, indicating whether you're likely to have any issues. And if you have issues, they can be kind of time consuming as well. So again, that's the other benefit of investment grade property, is they tend to be more hands off or less time consuming than other types of property. Okay, let's get into some questions. The first one is from Anne. Hi Stuart, thanks for the clear and well explained content. Very helpful. You're most welcome, Anne. I would like to ask about strategies for young people seeking to purchase a home. Our son is completing uni. He's got several part-time jobs and is a good saver. He's got very little expenses other than fuel in his social life because he lives at home with us. And he expects a well-paid career. He drip feeds money into ETFs and managed funds, as well as saving a decent amount of cash for a home deposit. He's keen to purchase a house in Brisbane in a few years' time. I wonder if you could outline your thoughts on different ways of achieving this. For example, he could live with us a bit longer and initially rent the house out, or he could live in the house straight away, maybe with some friends to occupy some spare rooms. How important is the CGT concessions in this decision? I'm also keen to understand your thoughts on how he should aim or what he should be looking for. It's tempting to look for the cheapest property that will meet your needs. I think that's what I did when I was that age. But if I had my time again, I would have looked for a better quality property, one that I would have been happy to live in for a longer time. Any thoughts on how to weigh up these options? Some people say bite off more than you can chew and chew like crazy. And if I could ask for your views on the loan structure as well. I expect he would continue to have a good level of savings even when he has a mortgage. Do you weigh up the benefits and flexibility of an offset facility versus a long-term fixed interest-only loan? Okay, and there's quite a bit there. It's a really important decision. And I guess as parents, we do reflect back on our own decision making, and hopefully we can educate our children, if they listen to us, to maybe not repeat those mistakes. And I would probably think the same thing. I probably could have extended myself a little bit more aggressively for the first property that I bought. Having said that, it did very well. It doubled in value in less than 5 years. A very expensive property, by the way, and it was in the sort of secondary suburbs of Melbourne. So it was all good, but, had my time again, I probably would have done something different knowing what I know today. Okay, so, the first thing, I've got a few comments here in no particular order. The way I look at it is that the level of my enthusiasm to help my sons is matched with their level of enthusiasm. So if they're not enthusiastic and they're not willing to make sacrifices, then neither am I. And I think that's really the best approach. Now, and your son sounds like he's got some part-time jobs and is a good saver and is really financially motivated to do a great job. And so if my child was in that space, I would be equally motivated to help help them do a good job. But, sometimes I meet with clients and they really want their child to buy a property because they know it's the best thing for them to do, but the child's lukewarm on the idea. Well, in that case, you can't really motivate someone to do something they don't want to do. And I think it doesn't always suit everyone. And this is my view, is that, you should just match your level of enthusiasm from that perspective. I think the best thing, the number one thing you need to be in place before a child can buy a property is a good, decent, predictable level of income. So, of course, finish uni, go and find yourself a job, a career. And when you're in that job for, say, 6 months, you'll have a good sense of whether it's something you enjoy, whether you see longevity in a career or industry like that. And it gives you a sense of comfort. Yes, I know the trajectory of my income and what's happening with my cash flow and those sorts of things. Once he's at that point, he should jump into the market as soon as he possibly could, but not before, not until he's got that confidence. The nil capital gains tax, the main residence exemption, I think is really critical. I think it's very, very important because there's very, very few things in life that are tax-free. Super eventually is, and the main residence exemption, so capital growth in our own home. And I think we should take advantage of that, particularly as a young person. Their goal is to try and build as much net worth, as in asset base, as quickly as possible. And, an easy way to destroy wealth is by paying more tax. So, if I was in your son's shoes, I would go and buy the property, live in it for, 3 to 6 months, make sure you keep all the records, utility bills, change all his addresses, licenses, and all those sorts of things and keep that evidence to show that it was genuinely his home. And then he might decide, look, cost of living and living by myself is too expensive. I'll move back into home in 3 to 6 months' time, and then he can rent the property out. But then at least the first 6 years, as long as he doesn't claim another main residence, at least the next 6 years are going to be tax-free. So I think that's a no-brainer. So it's not really a question of should he occupy the property or not in the longer term. That just comes back to, what his preferences are and what's going to work out better for him financially. But I think certainly try to make sure that he's going to get the main residence exemption, so occupy the property as soon as you purchase it. Now, in terms of budget, absolutely. I think bite off more you can chew and chew like hell. I think that's a great strategy. As I said, I probably was more conservative than I needed to be when I bought my first home. And if I had my time again, I would choose a bank purely by borrowing capacity if I was a first home buyer, because an extra 100,000 in terms of borrowing could get me a much, much better property. And he needs to approach it with an investment lens as well. He doesn't need to. That's my advice. It sounds a bit presumptuous to say he needs to do that, but my advice is approach it with an investment lens. So not so much I can see myself living in this property for the next 10 years and it suits my lifestyle, but more along the lines of, I think this is a good investment. I think this is going to maximize capital growth. I think in 10 years' time, someone's going to pay me twice as much as what I paid today. That's really the key question here. And typically it comes down to budget. The more you can spend, the greater the chance is you buy a higher quality property. So I would absolutely borrow until to the point where it gives you indigestion. And in terms of mortgage, I wouldn't care about the interest rate, which is not to say I'm going to pay any interest rate, but that's not my most important consideration if I'm a first home buyer. Having an interest only loan with an offset account is easily the most important factor for a first home buyer, because it allows me to put money in the offset so I can aggressively reduce debt or reduce my interest rate exposure if I want to, if I'm living at home or doing something else, but it still preserves the original tax deductible nature of the debt. So I'm not actually physically paying $1 of principal back, but I've got an offset account, so it does allow me to minimize interest over that time. Chances are the first property anyone buys isn't going to be their long-term home or their forever home or anything like that. It tends to be a stepping stone. Now, it might mean that you sell the property 10 years later and cash out and put that equity somewhere else, or it might mean you end up holding that property for the next 30 years. Either way, you want to maximize the gearing against that asset, and having an interest-only loan with an offset account is going to allow you to do that. Now, sometimes first home buyers can be a little bit cost conscious and say, but there's another provider that's going to give me an interest rate that's 0.2% lower. But the key things here are find a lender that's going to lend you the most amount of money, and then make sure that loan is on interest only basis so I don't have to pay $1 of principal back, and then buy a great asset. And I think if you do all those three things, you're going to be miles in front of what I did whenever it was 30 years ago. So hopefully that helps, and good luck to you and your son, and hope it works out. And really, hopefully that's good advice for everyone that's in Anne's position. Okay, I'm going to leave it there today. Next week, as I said, we've got Campbell doing the Q&A episode, so I appreciate his involvement. And on the Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about testamentary trusts and some other sort of estate planning matters. So we always get questions about testamentary trusts. And in fact, someone over on YouTube, one of the subscribers on YouTube, asked me to do an episode about it, and I complied. So that'll be next week. Until then, bye for now. Just a few things before we wrap up, if I may. Of course, you can send me questions at questions@investopoly.com.au. But for a quicker response, feel free to add a comment on the episode's video over on YouTube. We have an Investopoly YouTube channel, and the link is in the show notes. I'm incredibly grateful for the 4.9 star rating on Apple with over 400 reviews. Thank you so much. If you can leave a review or rating, I'd love it, because I'd love to get over 1,000 reviews. That's kind of my target. Keep checking the show notes for free downloads, and I include book discounts there as well. And of course, if you're interested in working with my team and I've included a web link where you can find out a little bit more about what we do and get in touch with us. And of course, until next time, bye for now.